Hey guys, welcome back to the Homestead Adventure. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be the cameraman as I have my brother-in-law show you how to butcher a deer. Now before we get started, I have an announcement to make. I just launched the Homestead Adventure podcast. I am so excited because I've been wanting to do this podcast for months, and I finally sat down and recorded my first episode, and I finally put it out. So, yay! You can find it on Apple Podcasts. It's called The Homestead Adventure. And I will also post a link in the description so you can find it. I'm so excited and a little bit nervous, but if you want to listen, go ahead and check that out. But otherwise, let's get started. So before we get started, I want to mention that, as you can see here, the deer has already been gutted. They do this in the woods so there is less weight to carry and less of a mess to deal with later. This deer has been hanging for a day in the garage. You can see here that they hung the deer from the neck. The reason they do this is because when they pull the hide off, there will be much less fur that sticks to the meat. The first thing you can see Paul doing here is he is slicing the hide from the belly to the neck. He is not cutting any meat here, just the hide. You will see that he is slicing the hide all around the top of the neck so they can start pulling the hide off. The next step is to slice the hide up the front legs. This will make it easier to pull the hide off. So he will slice up the leg and then in towards the sternum where he made the first cuts. Right here, he is using a knife to loosen the hide around the neck. Then they are using a pair of vice grips, so when they go to pull the hide down, they will have a better grip on it. It helps to have a few people doing this. If you are doing this alone, you may have to just cut the whole hide off, but with a few people, they can rip it off using their vice grips and pull down on the hide together. After pulling the hide halfway down, Paul is going to cut the front feet off at the joint with a knife.
There's 2 bits that are not going. Those cut it over part. 2 tendons across the front. 6 across the sides. Great big one in the back.
Before continuing to pull the hide off, Paul is going to slice the hide on the back legs as well, which makes skinning the legs much easier than if you tried to pull it off in a tube. As you slice the hide, try not to cut into the meat too much. As you can see here, he did cut a little bit of the meat, so be careful of that, though it's not going to hurt the meat if you do nick it here and there. Now it is time to pull the rest of the hide off. After getting past the tail, you will cut the tail off by placing the knife right in between the vertebra, and it should pop right off. When you get the hide past the knee joint on the back legs, it's time to cut the feet off. You'll be cutting these feet off the same way you did the front feet. Now what he is doing here is cutting these side flaps off. we are going to throw this out. It looks like you're throwing a lot out, but it's really only about 1/8 an inch thick and not even enough for a hamburger with both sides. So now we are going to cut the deer in half to make it easier to section up the meat.
Right here is where the tenderloins were, so I basically just picked the joint right above where the tenderloins connect. Okay. Right about at the folding rib.
It helps to have two people doing this, so one of you can hold onto the top of the deer and the other can twist the bottom half off. Next, we are going to take the bottom half of the deer to the basement where we can cut the meat off the bones and sort the meat into steaks and burgers. The first thing we are doing here is cutting at the hip joint. It's hard to see unless you cut it open, so this part can take some practice. Once you have made your cuts, you can spread the leg open a bit more and locate the hip joint where you will separate the leg from the hip. There is a tendon that holds the hip joint that you will cut, as you see here. There is a bone on the pelvis that will stick out a bit, so you just have to cut around that. Now you will do the same for the other leg. In the top corner here, there is a little bit of flank. So you are going to cut all of this fat off with that little bit of meat in the top corner that you want to keep. So we're going to cut the fat off of this piece of meat. You can use this fat for bird feeders or feed it to your other animals. This small chunk of meat will be ground into burgers. So here he is showing you the outside of the leg. We have two main muscle groups here. We have the round steaks that he is showing you right now, which are a little tough on deer, so that will be ground into burger. And we have the sirloin groups here. He is going to start by taking the sirloin groups off, which he will show you here. These sirloins will be cut into steaks, jerky, and roasts. This little piece that runs along the edge is a very tender piece of meat. You definitely want to save this piece. Usually they will make kebabs out of this piece. Right here, he is simply slicing the fat off the outside. Venison fat doesn't taste very good, so you are going to want to cut as much fat off as you can. This one he just cut off, he is going to throw in the burger bucket, and then it leaves you with the rest of the sirloin group here that he is going to continue cutting off now. So on the first sirloin group he cut off, he forgot to show how to take the large tendon off, which he will show now. He is going to slice at the top of the tendon and then stick his knife in between the tendon and the meat. Then he will simply pull the tendon off with his hands by sticking his fingers in where the cut was made and pulling towards the sides. Now we have the round and the shank. The round, which is what he is cutting off now, will be added to the burger bucket. Right here he is showing you the attachment to the knee that you'll have to cut around. Basically, you're slicing as close to the bone as you can to get as much meat off as possible. Here, he is simply cutting the round into smaller pieces so that it will fit into the grinder better. The reason the round is not used for steaks is it has a bunch of small tendons running through the meat. You can grind up these tendons, but it makes for a very chewy piece of meat if you were to try and use it as steaks. Now he is cutting the large tendons off the shank. The shank is pretty much the same as the round. It is full of tendons all the way through, so this will also be ground into burger. Like he did with the round, he's simply cutting the shank into smaller pieces to fit into the grinder. Right here, make sure you're paying attention to anything that feels like bone in the meat. In some deer, the tendons in this spot will calcify, which makes the tendons as hard as bone. It will feel like bone shards in the meat, so if you feel anything like that, make sure you cut that out so you don't grind that into the meat. This deer does not have any calcified tendons. Same thing here, he is just cutting this up for hamburger. Here he is just cutting off whatever meat is left and throwing it into the burger bucket. All the waste is fed to the cats, and the bones will be thrown right back into the woods for the wildlife to enjoy what's left. So now we are moving on to the backstrap. This one is going to be interesting because, as we showed earlier in the video, this deer was wounded with an arrow earlier in the season and now has a nasty pus pocket on the back. We will, of course, be cutting that off. The infection was in between the connective tissue, so we are able to save most of the meat here. He is going to be really careful with his part and not let any of the meat touch the infection. He will be able to show you on the clean side how you would normally cut the back straps off. The back strap is one of the best parts of the deer, so you won't be grinding this up. You will save this as steaks or cut into cubes, slices, jerky, whatever you want. The first thing he is doing here is cutting off the fat. There is only one tendon on this piece of meat, and that is the entire outside. There are a few methods to removing the tendon. The first method is to simply cut it off. Paul's method is to use the back of his knife and scrape at the tendon for a little bit to break it up off the meat. Then he will slide his knife into the middle of the tendon like he did with the one we showed you before. Then he will simply slide his hand in and pull the tendon off. With this method, you get very little waste, and it is also a lot faster than if you were to cut it off. The next step is to cut the back strap from the bone. Remember to save this piece for steaks. There isn't a great way to go about taking this part off. Just start cutting away at it, and these pieces will go into hamburger. This piece he is pointing to here is part of the sirloin that will be kept for stew chunks. Again, this piece here will be ground into hamburger. Right here, he is cutting off the sirloin. Keep this piece. This is hamburger that he is cutting off now. All of this is also hamburger. This one he is working on now is the other side of the sirloin that we are going to keep. After cutting all of those pieces off, he is simply going to continue to remove as much meat as he can from the bones before you move on to the top half of the deer. This is all the burger meat we got off the bottom half of the deer. This meat we are showing here is all the steaks we saved. Now we are back outside and the next step is cutting the head off. Paul is going to cut it off with a knife. You can use a saw, but he uses a knife to limit the amount of bone shards in the meat. It is easier to do this with 2 people. All he is doing here is cutting all the meat and tendons so they can twist the head off. After you have cut what you can, have one person hold on to the head and the other person will twist the body until the head comes off. Now we will take the top half down to the basement where we will cut the rest of the meat off. On here, you can see that the bullet went through this shoulder and came out this shoulder. The arms come off pretty easily and it will generally be all bloody in here, but the blood will generally stay in the tissue, so you can usually just wipe all of that off. Everything on the top half of the deer is hamburger except for the backstrap. This right here looks like a lot of meat, but it is mostly fat, so we are going to cut that off and discard it. This part is just a very thin muscle that will be thrown out. Cut all of this off and toss it. You can see here, Paul is simply scraping off the blood and it does not affect the meat. Then he will take a paper towel and wipe the rest of the blood off. Again, on the other side, he will scrape the blood off with his knife and wipe the rest off with a paper towel. Now he will begin to cut along the shoulder blade to to get as much meat off here. And remember, all of the meat on this section will be ground into burger, so all we are doing is cutting off all the meat that we can. With does and younger deer, you can save some of this meat, but with the bucks, you are better off making more burger since it's a little more tough. So here he is just separating all the meat from the bone and throwing this all into the burger bucket. Around the shoulder blade can be tricky, but basically just cut at it and get what you can off. Now it is time to do the top. Normally, you're going to save the backstrap like we did with the bottom half of the deer. But with the large wound this one has, we aren't even going to touch that part. Just do what we did with the other backstrap and save those pieces for steaks. We are not going to save any of the meat on the ribs. There just isn't enough meat there to worry about it, and since it was shot through the chest, there are going to be bone shards in there, so we're not even going to bother with saving any of that. Now he is just going to start cutting the neck meat off, and that will go into the burger bucket. Right here, he is going to make one long cut so he can pull the windpipe out. This thin piece he is pulling out is the throat. You do not want to save this piece, so just throw that out. Now he is just loosening up the meat around the windpipe. Sometimes you can just pull the windpipe out like this. The rest of the process is simply cutting away at it and getting as much meat off as you can, and that's pretty much it. These little bumps right here are lymph nodes that you're going to want to cut out. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I know I did. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. And don't forget to go check out the Homestead Adventure podcast as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you on the next adventure. Bye, guys.